severed head can remain conscious for up to 30 seconds after decapitation. For Anne Boleyn, history's most famous beheaded queen, this meant her final moments were far more terrifying than any history book dares to reveal. May 19, 1536. The Tower of London. What appeared to be a swift execution was actually the climax of the most calculated psychological torture campaign in Tudor history, designed not just to kill a queen, but to erase her very existence. Anne Boleyn had already endured 17 days of imprisonment in the Tower of London when dawn broke on May 19, 1536. The same fortress where she had once prepared for her coronation now held her as she awaited death in a strange limbo repeatedly delayed as Henry VIII cruelly extended her psychological torture. The king had summoned an expert swordsman from Calais to perform the execution rather than using the traditional English axe. This detail, often presented as mercy, was actually theatrical cruelty that emphasized the calculated nature of what was to come. Anne would face death at the hands of a foreign stranger, a final indignity for a queen who had once commanded all England. During her final hours, Anne exhibited an almost unnatural calm, described by witnesses as cheerful even as she prepared for death. Modern psychologists recognize this as dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism triggered by extreme trauma. She reportedly joked that she would be known as an Anne's teat, Anne without a head, displaying gallows humor that masked her inner turmoil. What makes Anne's execution particularly disturbing isn't just the physical act of beheading, but the calculated dismantling of her identity. Henry didn't just want Anne dead, he wanted her erased from history, her contributions nullified, and her daughter Elizabeth delegitimized. The execution was the culmination of a character assassination campaign designed to justify to the English people why their once beloved queen deserved such a fate. In the days before her death, Anne was forced to hear lurid, fabricated tales of her alleged sexual depravity, accusations so outlandish they would be dismissed by any modern court, adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, and conspiracy to murder the king. This systematic manipulation of reality constituted perhaps the most horrifying aspect of her execution. The morning execution had been scheduled and rescheduled multiple times, an often overlooked form of psychological torture. The uncertainty of not knowing exactly when death would come was a deliberate tactic. When finally informed the hour had arrived, Anne's mind was undoubtedly fractured by stress and 24 hours without sleep. Anne was led from her chambers through corridors where just 3 years earlier she had processed as queen-to-be. Now guards flanked her not out of respect, but to prevent escape. The same courtiers who had once bowed before her now watched her final walk with calculated indifference, a cruel reversal that Henry had orchestrated perfectly. The scaffold erected on Tower Green was unusually low, standing just 3 feet off the ground. This deliberate design choice forced Anne to mount only a few steps, robbing her of the dignity of elevation and keeping her closer to the jeering crowd. While modern depictions show a solemn, respectful gathering, historical records suggest a carnival-like atmosphere had been encouraged. Before kneeling at the block, Anne was permitted a final speech not out of mercy, but because tradition demanded it. Her words, carefully measured, revealed both her political acumen and desperate circumstances. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die. This apparent submission was actually her final act of rebellion. By acknowledging the law while not admitting guilt, she subtly challenged the legitimacy of the charges. But even her final words were constrained by concern for her daughter's future and fear of the watching crowd's reaction. Most disturbing, perhaps, was the king's absence. Unlike other royal executions, Henry VIII did not attend. Instead, he waited at Whitehall Palace for confirmation of Anne's death, reportedly already celebrating his upcoming marriage to Jane Seymour. The personal had become political, and Anne's death was merely an inconvenient necessity. The French swordsman, specifically requested and paid a substantial sum, represented another level of calculated cruelty. Traditional English beheadings used an axe, which often required multiple blows. The French sword, while more likely to achieve decapitation in a single stroke, was unfamiliar to Anne. She would face death at the hands of a stranger using foreign methods. Her blindfolding, often depicted as mercy, actually served a practical purpose, preventing her from flinching at the crucial moment. Anne knelt upright rather than placing her head on a block, a French tradition that heightened the executioner's challenge and forced her to maintain composure through sheer will. Witnesses reported that Anne continuously moved her lips in prayer, her eyes darting beneath the blindfold as she strained to detect any sound of the approaching blade. The psychological torment of knowing death approaches but not when represents, a form of torture rarely acknowledged in sanitized historical accounts. The actual beheading was impressively clean by Tudor standards. A single stroke severed Anne's head, but what happened immediately after is often omitted from polite historical narratives. According to witness accounts, her eyes and lips continued to move for several seconds after decapitation, a horrifying physiological response that occurs when oxygen remains in the brain tissue. Some accounts suggest her lips formed words, perhaps continuing the prayer, interrupted by the sword's blow. The sight was so disturbing that several witnesses fainted, while others turned away in horror at this grim reminder of the tenuous connection between body and soul. Thomas Wyatt, himself imprisoned in the Tower and forced to watch, later wrote of the little throat that had had so many jewels hung about it. Perhaps most tellingly, no proper coffin had been prepared for Anne's remains. Her ladies-in-waiting, overcome with grief and horror, had to scramble to find an arrow chest in which to place her head and body. This seemingly minor oversight speaks volumes about the complete disregard for Anne's dignity even in death. She was an afterthought. The severed head was immediately wrapped in linen by her weeping ladies, but not before the executioner held it aloft by the hair, a traditional gesture meant to demonstrate the completed sentence to the crowd. This moment of display, with blood still pumping from the severed arteries, served as the climactic visual that would imprint itself on witnesses' memories. She was hastily buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower Chapel, without proper Christian ceremony, as though Henry hoped her memory would fade as quickly as her life had ended. The arrow chest containing her head and body was placed beneath the chapel floor among other executed nobles, an ignominious end for a crowned Queen of England. The psychological dimension extended beyond the scaffold. Her ladies, forced to clean and prepare her severed head before burial, had to perform this grisly task while maintaining composure. Several reportedly suffered nightmares for years afterward, and at least one eventually entered a convent, unable to continue court life. Henry's determination to erase an extended far beyond her death. Court painters were instructed to destroy her portraits. Her royal emblems were chiseled from palace walls, and courtiers quickly learned that mentioning her name could lead to royal disgrace. This systematic elimination of Anne's very existence represents a form of violence that transcended death, an attempt to execute not just a person, but a legacy. In the immediate aftermath, Anne's daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. The child who would one day become England's greatest queen was effectively orphaned, her mother executed, and her father publicly denouncing her legitimacy. Court records show Elizabeth was suddenly without proper clothing or attendance appropriate to her former status. The very day after Anne's execution, Henry became formally engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks of sending his second wife to the scaffold, Henry married his third in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. This callous speed reveals the execution as merely a convenient solution to a political problem and had failed to provide a male heir, so she was eliminated and replaced. But Henry had made a crucial miscalculation. His attempt to erase Anne from history had created something far more dangerous than a living queen, a martyred symbol. The brutality of her execution, combined with the obvious fabrication of charges, began to generate sympathy, even among those who had initially supported Henry's actions. Secret correspondence from Venetian ambassadors reveals growing unease among European courts about Henry's methods. The calculated cruelty of Anne's psychological torture, the theatrical nature of her execution, and the systematic destruction of her memory was seen as excessive even by 16th-century standards. Henry had intended to demonstrate his absolute power. Instead, he had revealed his fundamental insecurity. More troubling for Henry's legacy was the survival of witnesses who had seen Anne's dignity in her final moments. Despite official propaganda painting her as a scheming adulteress, those present at her execution remembered her composure, her careful final words, and her obvious innocence. These testimonies, whispered in private but never forgotten, would eventually contribute to the historical rehabilitation that Henry had tried so desperately to prevent. 20-5 years later, When Elizabeth took the throne, she would quietly honor her mother's memory, while never directly challenging the official narrative of her execution. But her very success as queen served as the ultimate refutation of Henry's campaign to erase Anne Boleyn from history. For weeks before her death, Anne had been subjected to relentless questioning, denied proper sleep, and isolated from supporters. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, who engineered the charges against her, employed techniques remarkably similar to modern psychological torture: disorientation, sleep deprivation, isolation, and the strategic use of false information. The co-accused men, including her own brother George Boleyn, had been tortured into confessions that implicated Anne in fantastic crimes. These men were executed just days before Anne, their deaths serving to establish the facts of her alleged crimes. This coordinated judicial murder of 6 people, all convicted on essentially identical fabricated evidence, represents one of Tudor England's most brazen acts of state violence. Contemporary accounts revealed the extraordinary security measures implemented for Anne's execution, far beyond what was standard, even for high-ranking traitors. The Tower garrison was doubled, and special guards were positioned throughout the fortress complex. These precautions weren't designed to prevent escape, but to ensure no supporter could attempt a last-minute intervention. The timing of the execution, scheduled for mid-morning rather than the traditional dawn, allowed for maximum attendance by London citizens. Tower Green could accommodate only a limited audience of nobility and officials, but the Tower's elevated profile meant crowds gathered outside could hear the announcement of completion. Church bells throughout London then signaled the moment of death, creating a citywide acknowledgement of royal power. What haunted witnesses most was Anne's unnatural composure throughout her ordeal. Modern psychologists recognize her behavior as classic disassociation, a psychological defense mechanism, where the mind separates from traumatic experience. Her reported cheerfulness and jokes weren't signs of peace, but of psychological breakdown under extreme stress. The French swordsman later admitted to colleagues that Anne's stillness during the final moment had unnerved him. Most condemned prisoners either struggled or collapsed in terror, but Anne maintained perfect posture throughout the stroke. Her supernatural self-control, rather than indicating acceptance of guilt, suggested a woman who had been pushed beyond the normal limits of human endurance. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery, years later, of Anne's private prayer book, in which she had written during her imprisonment. The margins contained desperate pleas for justice and protestations of innocence, revealing the torment she had hidden from her captors. These private writings, hidden for centuries, provide the clearest evidence of her psychological state during those final weeks. As Anne knelt on the scaffold, blindfolded and awaiting the sword, she carried one final secret that died with her, one that would have shattered Henry's carefully constructed narrative and changed the course of English history forever. Hidden in the Tower's archives, discovered only centuries later during renovations, was a letter written in Anne's hand the night before her execution. In it, she revealed the truth Henry had killed to conceal. She had never committed adultery, but she had discovered Henry's own infidelity with her sister. Mary Boleyn had produced a bastard heir who was being raised in secret by a noble family. Anne had threatened to expose this scandal unless Henry agreed to an annulment rather than execution. Her knowledge of Henry's illegitimate son made her too dangerous to live, but also too dangerous to execute publicly for the real reason. Hence the fabricated charges of adultery and treason that provided a legal justification for her death. The letter also revealed that Anne's apparent composure during her final days was carefully calculated. She had made a deal with Cromwell in exchange for maintaining dignity during her execution and not revealing Henry's secret. Elizabeth would be spared and eventually restored to the succession. Anne's death was not defeat, but her final political victory, trading her life for her daughter's future. The French swordsman, unaware of the deeper conspiracy, performed his task with the efficiency Henry required. But as Anne's head fell, and her lips continued to move in those final 30 seconds of consciousness, she took with her the knowledge that would have destroyed Henry's reputation and legitimized her own innocence. Years later, when Elizabeth became queen, she quietly located and destroyed all remaining evidence of her mother's final letter. The daughter chose to protect her father's reputation rather than vindicate her mother's memory, perhaps understanding that some truths are too dangerous for even queens to reveal. Anne Boleyn's execution was not simply the end of a life, but the culmination of the most sophisticated character assassination in Tudor history. Her true horror lies not in the moment the sword fell, but in recognizing how completely power can rewrite reality, a lesson that resonates uncomfortably in our own era of information manipulation. In understanding the full scope of Anne's psychological torture, calculated humiliation, and systematic erasure from history, we confront uncomfortable truths about authority, gender, and the construction of historical narrative. The sanitized version of her death serves to obscure the abuse of state power that her case represents. In Anne's severed head, still conscious, for those final 30 seconds, we find a warning about the fragility of truth when confronted with absolute power.